Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something fundamental, really. Why is it sometimes just so hard, for us to accept difficult truths? Especially now, with information just flying at us from everywhere.
It's a huge question.
Yeah, like what's going on inside our own heads? What
Yeah.
makes us resist reality sometimes or cling to beliefs that aren't really true?
Well, it turns out our brains aren't just neutral processors, are they? They're also designed to protect us, to manage anxiety, keep our self-image intact, deal with, a complicated world.
Right. And for this deep dive, we've gathered quite a bit of material research papers, articles, some notes, all looking into the psychology behind this.
Yeah, covering quite a range. Things like defense mechanisms, cognitive biases, even this idea of truth decay.
Exactly. So the mission here isn't about judging what anyone believes. Not at all.
No.
It's about understanding how our minds actually work when they face information that's uncomfortable or confusing or just plain overwhelming.
By unpacking these mental strategies and shortcuts, the hope is you, the listener, get a clearer view of what's influencing your own thinking and what's happening out there in the world.
Yeah, maybe get better equipped to sort through it all.
Exactly.
Okay, so where do we start? One of the big ideas from the sources seems to be these things called defense mechanisms.
Right, classic psychological concept. You can think of them as the mind's sort of internal bodyguards.
Bodyguards, I like that.
Yeah.
Ways we cope when reality gets a bit too much.
Precisely. They're mostly unconscious strategies the ego uses to handle things that trigger anxiety or feel threatening. Their main job, according to one source, is protecting our mental state, our self-image, when we just can't deal with something head-on right then.
Okay, and Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, she expanded on this work, right? Mapped out quite a few of them.
She did, and it's important to say we all use these. They're normal. They can even be healthy ways to cope with stress in the short term.
But the problem comes when they become the only way we deal with things, or we rely on them too heavily.
That's when they can become maladaptive, yeah. Our sources highlighted several key ones. Maybe the most obvious is denial.
Just refusing to accept something is real because it's too painful.
Pretty much. Like a victim of a crime might initially deny it even happened. It shields them from the immediate shock and anxiety.
Okay. Short-term relief. What else?
Then there's rationalization. This is a common one.
Justifying something?
Yeah, making up logical-sounding reasons for a feeling or behavior when the real reason is less acceptable. Like, you get turned down for a loan for a house.
And you tell yourself, oh, that house was too big anyway, didn't really want it.
Exactly that. Then projection. That's a fascinating one.
Where you see your own unwanted feelings in someone else.
You got it. You might be feeling attracted to someone outside your relationship, but instead you become convinced your partner is cheating. You project your feeling onto them.
Wow, okay. I see.
Our sources also mention intellectualization.
Thinking about stressful things in a really cold, clinical way.
Yeah, focusing on the abstract facts and logic to avoid the messy emotions. Someone losing a family member might throw themselves into making funeral arrangements, focusing on the tasks instead of feeling the grief.
Keeping the emotions at arm's length.
Right. And displacement, taking feelings out on a safer target.
Like being furious with your boss but yelling at your spouse or kids instead.
Classic example. And repression, which is unconsciously pushing unpleasant thoughts or memories completely out of awareness. Like someone abused as a child might have no memory of it.
That's different from suppression, right? The sources mentioned that too.
Good point. Suppression is conscious. You know the unpleasant thought or memory is there, but you actively choose to push it away, not think about it. Repression is deeper. It's unconscious forgetting.
Got it. Okay. There are a few more listed. Sublimation.
Yeah, that's often seen as a more mature defense. Converting unacceptable impulses into socially acceptable actions. Like, you're really upset with your partner, so you go for a long run or channel it into artwork.
Turning negative energy into something else. Okay.
Regression is reverting to earlier, maybe more childish behaviors when stressed.
Like hugging a teddy bear or whining.
Could be, yeah. And finally, reaction formation. Replacing an unwanted impulse with its complete opposite.
So if you're actually really sad about a breakup, you act overly happy and cheerful.
Exactly. You behave in a way directly contradicting the underlying feeling. So, that's a quick tour. Sometimes lists focus on maybe 7 key ones, but those 10 give a good picture.
They really do. And it's clear how they're all about managing difficult realities or emotions, just in different ways, protecting the self.
Precisely. And like we said, healthy people use them. It's the overuse, the rigidity that leads to problems.
Okay, let's zoom in on one you mentioned. Denial. It seems particularly relevant to our theme of resisting reality.
It really is. It's that fundamental refusal to acknowledge something true but perceived as unacceptable or painful. It buys time, essentially, lets you avoid anxiety and keep functioning, at least for a while.
But it goes beyond just personal denial, doesn't it? One source talks about denialism.
Yes, denialism is more like an ideology of denial. It's the active rejection of basic facts or reality, often specifically aimed at established scientific consensus.
We see this with things like, well, climate change is a big one mentioned.
Climate change, the link between HIV and AIDS historically, sometimes vaccine safety, evolution, even the safety of genetically modified foods in some circles, rejecting what the overwhelming evidence or scientific agreement says.
And this ties into something really interesting the sources call the social organization of denial. This isn't just one person, it's like a group thing.
Exactly. It's about how shared cultural practices, norms, and ways of talking can work to keep disturbing or inconvenient knowledge out of collective awareness.
How does that work?
Well, it can be subtle. Things like unspoken rules about not asking awkward questions, a kind of collective preference not to be told certain things, avoiding topics deemed too political or uncomfortable at the dinner table.
Or using euphemisms, right?
Yeah.
Softening the language around difficult issues.
Yes, precisely. All these things can discourage people from really engaging with serious social problems because the group subtly signals that it's not okay or not comfortable to do so.
It's like a conspiracy of silence, almost, but maybe not consciously plotted.
Sort of, yeah. And emotions are huge here. The sources point out that fear, feeling helpless, feeling guilty, these can be powerful motivators for avoiding information, both for individuals and for groups. If knowing something makes you feel bad or overwhelmed, denial is tempting.
That makes sense. And it connects to identity, too, right?
Yeah.
Especially collective identity.
Absolutely. Denialism often kicks in when facts threaten a group's core beliefs or self-image. The source gave an example from Norway.
Yeah, the idea of a strong national self-image as environmentally friendly clashing with the reality of, say, oil production.
Exactly. To acknowledge the contradiction fully would force a painful reevaluation of that identity. So instead, people might engage in what the source calls perspectival selectivity.
Cherry-picking the facts that fit the desired image.
Or selective interpretation, framing the facts, using cultural narratives that downplay the conflict. It's all about protecting that collective sense of self.
That's identity-protective cognition, but scaled up to a group or even national level.
You got it.
Wow. Okay, this leads us pretty naturally into a broader issue highlighted in the sources, this concept of truth decay.
Right. This moves beyond individual psychology to look at a societal trend. It's not just about us denying facts, but about the changing landscape of information itself.
And the sources define it by, what, 4 main trends?
Yeah. First, increasing disagreement about basic facts and data, not just opinions or policies. Second, a serious blurring of the line between opinion and fact.
I definitely see that.
Third, the sheer volume and influence of opinion and personal experience seems to be growing relative to objective fact. And fourth, declining trust in sources we used to rely on, like government data, mainstream media, academic experts.
It paints a pretty bleak picture of our information environment. It's hard to know what or who to trust.
It really is. And one RAND study we looked at tried to figure out what psychological factors make people more susceptible or maybe more resistant to this truth decay.
What did they find? Anything surprising?
Well, some things were maybe predictable, like having stronger numeracy skills, being good with numbers, and better scientific reasoning abilities, generally linked to being more resistant to misinformation.
Okay, that makes sense. If you can analyze data or understand scientific method, you're less easily fooled.
Right. And they also found that magical reasoning, relying on intuition, gut feeling, superstition, maybe paranormal beliefs, that was negatively correlated with accepting scientific consensus, and also negatively correlated with rejecting false conspiracy theories.
So less likely to accept science and more likely to fall for conspiracies if you lean towards magical thinking. Still seems intuitive.
It does, but here's where it got really interesting, especially with in-group bias.
Okay, what's the twist?
The study found that having a strong identification with your group high in-group bias was actually a good predictor of rejecting false conspiracy theories.
Huh. Why would that be?
The thinking is strong group loyalty makes you protective. You're vigilant against potentially harmful misinformation that could damage your group's reputation or interests. So you police those kinds of external, potentially damaging narratives.
Okay, but There's a but, isn't there?
There's a big but. That same strong in-group identification was negatively associated with endorsing scientific consensus and even verifiable facts, if those facts came from perceived outgroups or challenged the in-group's worldview.
Whoa. Okay, unpack that. Loyalty helps you spot some falsehoods, but makes you reject other truths.
It seems so. It suggests your group allegiance can trump factual acceptance if the facts feel threatening to the group. It helps you fight off conspiracies about your group, but might make you reject scientific findings that challenge your group.
So group identity becomes the primary filter for truth.
In many cases, yes. It frames science denial not just as a misunderstanding of facts, but potentially as a form of intergroup conflict.
Like those scientists, they're not us. They have an agenda against us.
Exactly. If scientists are seen as a kind of hostile outgroup, their findings will be met with suspicion or outright rejection if they clash with the in-group's identity or sacred values. The sources mentioned a study involving gamers.
Ah, yeah, where gamers who strongly identified as gamers were more likely to reject studies linking violent games to aggression.
Precisely. They saw the researchers as an outgroup unfairly attacking their group in pastime.
That really highlights the power of identity.
It does, and the sources point out how starkly this plays out politically now. Acceptance of scientific findings on topics like evolution, climate change, vaccines, it often splits sharply along political identity lines. And it's not just one side. Another example given was liberals being more skeptical of, say, nanotechnology.
So it's this identity-protective cognition, again, driving belief more than the evidence itself.
It seems to be a major factor. So it's not just individual defense mechanisms, it's these social identities and biases, too.
Which brings us to another set of mental shortcuts, cognitive biases.
Right. These aren't necessarily about protecting emotions like defense mechanisms. They're more like systematic errors in our thinking process. Glitches in the software, maybe?
Mental shortcuts that help us process information quickly, especially when things are complicated or uncertain.
Exactly. The brain uses heuristics, rules of thumb, based on perception or past experience rather than purely logical analysis. They work often, but they can also lead us astray.
And the big one everyone talks about is confirmation bias.
Definitely. The tendency to look for, interpret, favor, and remember information that, well, confirms what we already think.
So you read an article and you pick out the bits that support your view and ignore the rest.
Or you only click on headlines you already agree with. It reinforces existing beliefs. And related to this is the backfire effect the sources mention.
That's the really weird one where challenging someone's belief with facts can actually make them believe it more strongly.
Yeah, it's like the challenge triggers a defensive reaction that reinforces the original belief. Super counterintuitive and frustrating if you're trying to correct misinformation.
Definitely. Okay, what other biases were highlighted?
Availability bias. This is where we judge the likelihood or importance of something based on how easily examples come to mind.
So if you just saw lots of news reports about shark attacks,
you might overestimate the actual risk of being attacked by a shark compared to, say, the risk of drowning, simply because the shark attacks are more vivid and easily recalled.
even if statistically drowning is a much bigger risk.
Right. Your judgment is biased by what's available in your memory. The sources also mention proportionality bias.
The idea that big events must have big causes.
Yeah. It feels somehow wrong or unsatisfying to think a huge, impactful event could be caused by something small, random, or mundane. So we might lean towards explanations involving it could be a contributing factor, yes. And generally, our sources note that our basic cognitive limitations, just, not being great intuitive statisticians, struggling with probability or exponential growth, combine with these biases to make understanding complex modern problems really difficult.
Like sustainability, climate change, pandemics.
Yeah.
Things involving complex systems and nonlinear effects. Our mental shortcuts aren't built for that.
They really aren't. Which leads to another key concept from the sources. The focus principle, sometimes called what you see is all there is, or WYSIAD.
WYSIAD. Okay, what's that?
It's the idea that our minds build narratives and make judgments based only on the information that's immediately activated or easily accessible stuff that's visible, emotionally charged. We tend to ignore what we don't know or what's complex and abstract.
So we create a coherent story from incomplete data, and because the story feels coherent, we assume it's accurate and complete.
Exactly. It leads to overconfidence. We think we understand something fully because the picture our mind presents feels complete, even though it's based on a limited, biased subset of information.
It's like our conscious awareness gets this neat summary, but it doesn't see all the messy data and uncertainty that got left out.
Precisely. And that connects very neatly to belief perseverance.
Okay, which
Just
is...
holding on to a belief even after the evidence that originally supported it has been totally debunked or discredited.
Wow, so even if you find out the study you based your belief on was flawed, you might still keep the belief.
You might.
Yeah.
The sources mention three main types of beliefs where this happens. Beliefs about ourselves, like our skills or body image, beliefs about other people, friends, family, and our naive theories about how the world works, like stereotypes or social theories.
And this is linked to confirmation bias again, I suppose.
Definitely. Once a belief is formed, especially if it's tied to our identity, we tend to selectively notice, interpret, and recall information in ways that keep supporting it. Disconfirming evidence gets ignored, rationalized away, or maybe just doesn't even register consciously. It takes real effort to overturn these established beliefs.
Okay, let's try and pull these pieces together then. We've got defense mechanisms shielding our emotions.
Protecting the ego.
Cognitive biases acting as mental shortcuts, filtering information.
Often reinforcing what we already think.
And then social factors like group identity, influencing what information we even consider trustworthy.
Right, and when reality clashes with our beliefs or our identity or a group's norms, all these systems can work together to make us resist, deny, or just stick with what we already believe.
It really shows why accepting certain facts, especially complex or challenging ones, can be so incredibly difficult for us. It's not just about logic.
Not at all. It's deeply tied to our emotional well-being, our mental efficiency, and our sense of belonging. And often, accuracy takes a back seat to those other needs.
And the sources even hinted that a lot of this processing, this filtering and defending happens non-consciously, right, below the surface of our awareness.
Yes, that's a key point in some of the material. Our conscious experience might just be the tip of the iceberg. The brain does incredible amounts of sophisticated processing non-consciously, much faster than conscious thought. What we experience as our thinking or deciding might just be a kind of edited summary presented after the fact.
So that feeling of being in control, rationally weighing evidence, might be partly an illusion.
It could be more limited than we assume, yes. The brain constructs a narrative of control. And even as we develop things like AI and complex human-machine systems, what one source called cognitive assemblages.
Where thinking is distributed between people and tech.
Right, like in high-frequency trading or autonomous vehicles. Even there, the sources suggest humans retain a unique role, perhaps driven by these deeper, non-conscious processes, especially when it comes to things like ethics and moral judgment. So human cognition, with all its biases and defenses, remains central, even as we recognize its limits.
Okay, so if these mechanisms and biases are so ingrained, so automatic, what can we actually do about it? Do the sources offer any countermeasures?
They do offer some ideas, yes. One concept that comes up is intellectual humility.
Which is basically admitting you might be wrong.
Sort of, yeah. More formally, it's seen as a virtue. It involves actively questioning what you think you know, being genuinely open to revising your views if the evidence warrants it, and recognizing the inherent limits of your own knowledge and understanding.
It sounds like the opposite of WISIAD, deliberately looking for what you don't see.
That's a great way to put it. Acknowledging your mental map might be incomplete or flawed.
Okay, what else?
Another practice discussed is radical acceptance. This comes more from a therapeutic context, I think.
Accepting things that feel unacceptable? How does that work?
It's a process. It involves first acknowledging the reality, even if it's painful, and noticing your emotional triggers around it. Then, recognizing you might not be able to control the causes or the reality itself. Then, crucially, acting as if you accept it, even if you don't feel acceptance yet. Allowing yourself to feel the difficult emotions without judgment and committing to this practice over time.
That sounds incredibly difficult. Choosing to face a painful truth instead of pushing it away.
It is challenging, but potentially transformative. It's about integrating reality rather than constantly fighting it. And on a more specific level, dealing with belief perseverance after you've been exposed to misinformation, one source suggests things like awareness training.
Becoming more aware of your own biases in action.
Exactly. Learning to recognize the telltale signs in your own thinking. And also counter-speech.
What's that? Arguing with yourself?
Kind of. Actively generating and considering arguments against the false belief or misinformation you encountered. Deliberately engaging with the counter evidence instead of just dismissing it.
So it really seemed like awareness is the critical first step across the board.
It looks that way. Understanding that these defense mechanisms and cognitive biases are operating, often automatically, is step one. Then you can start to consciously apply strategies to question your assumptions, manage your emotional reactions, and evaluate information more critically.
Building a more deliberate relationship with information and with reality itself.
Yeah, recognizing that our first gut reaction might be driven by these unconscious protectors or shortcuts, and not necessarily by the objective truth of the situation.
This deep dive really has illuminated just how intricate our internal world is, hasn't it? How our minds grapple with information. It's clear we have these powerful, mostly hidden tools, defenses, biases shaping our view of reality.
And making it tough sometimes to accept things that challenge us.
But hopefully understanding how these processes work in ourselves, and maybe in others too, is valuable. It's that first step toward navigating all this complexity more effectively.
Right. It gives you a chance to notice when your own mind might be resisting something or taking a shortcut, or maybe putting group loyalty ahead of the facts.
Which really leaves us with a final thought to chew on, doesn't it? If these mechanisms and biases are so deeply wired and so much happens outside our conscious awareness, how much real control do we actually have over what we end up believing?
Yeah. And if our conscious mind is working with a filtered summary, what does genuine, deep understanding truly demand from us? Something to think about.